Okay, so I want to make sure that we have time to engage with today's topic. So I'm just going to kind of jump right in and do some introductions of our symposium panel, and then give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. And we have a good, I think this size of audience is nice, so we can have good informal discussions together. This is a good group size for talking to one another. So I encourage that throughout our session. If you have questions or comments, feel free to chime in. So my name is Brendan Egan. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet me yet, or I haven't had a chance to meet, and I'm the Associate Director for Partnerships and Community Engagement at the Epistemic Analytics Lab at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research at the UW-Madison, or University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm really fortunate to have had the privilege of getting to know and work with our great set of panelists over the years. So I'm really excited about who's here with us today. I'll start off by introducing Amanda Siebert-Evenstone. You'd think we're friends for so long, I shouldn't fumble your name. It's the caffeine this morning. But Amanda is an instructor in the Educational Psychology Department, also a creative producer for the Learning Analytics Master's Program here at UW-Madison, and a research associate at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, all at the same institution as I am. Then we also have Lydia Ashton, who's an assistant professor at the University of Madison's, UW-Madison's Consumer Science Department, and Nancy Wong, who's the Coles Chair in Retail Innovation and the Department Chair of Professor of Consumer Science in the School of Human Ecology at UW-Madison. We also have Moira Fall. Before I say that, Lydia and Nancy are leading efforts at UW to use QE techniques on free and available user-generated content to improve Social Security Administration's Social Security Disability Insurance Program in the United States. And they've been invited by the Social Security Administration Board to present their ongoing research. So there's some uptake with their ideas and research, which is great. Moira Fall is the Executive Director at NORAG, Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. And it's a global membership-based network of international policies and cooperation in education. Moira is the Executive Director, and and she has extensive experience in international policy and research, and has worked with Eric Hamilton, who I'm about to introduce, in bringing QE into the policy realm. I felt really lucky that we met at ICQE21, and Moira had incredible ideas, and I think we engaged with some challenging truths as we try to grow and share QE more broadly. And then last but not least, we have Eric Hamilton, who's the Jan and Robert Davidson Endowed Professor of Education and Technology in the Education Division at the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University. Eric has also held 2 directorship positions at the National Science Foundation. He's worked at UNESCO's International Bureau of Education and is an early adopter of QE. So just want to welcome all of our panelists today. So as a quick kind of roadmap of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be discussing, we can think about things kind of progressing in 3 tiers. The first is looking at national policy at a local level, looking at kind of planned and enacted curriculum and alignment for the next generation science standards in the United States, but that could have local implications. All of this can, but in particular, you can think about in classrooms or planned curricular activities. You'll see more when Amanda explains. And then we're going to be moving on to another national level policy for the Social Security Administration and SSDI that Lydia and Nancy will be talking about. And then we're going to move to the international policy level with Moira and Eric after that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Amanda and ask us to tell us just a little bit about how you've used QE and ENA to engage with policy, specifically looking at the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. So take it away,
Great.
Amanda.
Am I showing full screen, or do you see my notes?
Nope, full screen. You're looking good.
I am looking good. I'm feeling good. It's a good Monday morning here. So I want to start this off talking about some of the work I did about the Next Generation Science Standards using QE. So I started this project because I loved science instruction, and there was this policy document that was out in the world trying to change the landscape of science education. And it looks like this. So one of the first things that I did, and one of the things you'll notice, is that in the policy world, there's lots of documents. And one of the first steps is trying to essentially understand them and pick them up and figure out, what are we going to do with all of these pages? So, this is the document that is sent to teachers and curriculum designers, instructors, departments of public instruction. How could I take this and turn it into something usable, right? Like what can we learn from this? This is a policy that's been enacted in 44 states, have had some influence in this, and the number is growing. And so what I want to do is think about this in terms of how are we relating this to other documents. So standards are these targets that we set for what students know and should be able to do. And a lot of time that we do this work, we want to make comparisons between standards and, let's say, standardized tests and assessments. And so some people check consistency between them, essentially looking at if 10% of the standards are about natural selection, then 10% of my test should be about natural selection. Some people have added more multi-topics so that they could look for things like cognitive demands, and then looking at the relationship between the two, visualizing it in these ways that you can look at the scanned comparison. And things like this can be really helpful when we're looking at just one-to-one documents. But a lot of times we're interested in more than just this relationship. We want to learn about other materials like textbooks or student notebooks or the online tools that we've created to support them, or the classroom discussions around it. And how do we may want to compare the alignments or think about how they relate back to the standards themselves, or look at the relationships really among everything. And so in the work that I have most recently done, I focused on looking at the relationship between the standards themselves, the textbooks surrounding them, and the classroom discussions. And I use a QE approach, and mostly this slide is here because there's a book with Brendan and my name on it, and it always feels cool to put that in. But the way that I've thought about this, and if you're interested later, I'll be presenting the qualitative story and grounded analysis, but thinking about how are we relating, creating this loop between the qualitative stories, what's locally happening in these documents, looking at it more globally in the statistical way, and then essentially looking back. And the real key to all of this is that if we find a common set of codes, so you could, by finding a common set of codes, we're actually able to compare all of these ideas in the same way, right? We have a common way of analyzing things. And in this case, this is a messy image because, like any policy document, there were, 100 things they wanted to look at, and I chose 15 of them. And those 15, being able to have those 15 codes made it so that I could do model comparisons within the standards themselves, and looking at how do elementary, middle, and high school standards compare to each other. And happily, they actually are different from each other. And you can do statistical analyses. So now we have this ability to go from standards to quantitative comparisons and looking at these differences. We can look at them in terms of, these were science standards. Do they actually talk about different things across the different sciences? And the answer is yes, but mostly the biggest difference is between engineering and the sciences themselves. By creating this space and this ability to essentially just look at codes, we're able to take the student notebooks, the classroom discussion, the textbooks, and put them in the space and then learn more about them as well. So I could compare things like the chemistry student notebook with how they talked in the class. When the notebooks had much more conceptual connections, and the discourse was talking a lot more about practices. Same with, we could compare notebooks. We could compare notebooks to the standards. We can compare a different notebook to the standards. Now we have this sort of measurement piece. And all of this is essentially there because when we have these policy documents, one way that we can get them all to talk to each other in the same space is when we have a common set of codes, we do a QE analysis, and we're able to actually take these into ENA and do these pieces. Now, breaking it down, essentially, when we think about policy analysis from a QE lens, we could choose the different data sources. So this is the policy documents, all the different planned, enacted, et cetera, curriculum that we might be interested in. Conduct a grounded analysis. You have to actually read it. So I would never advocate that we just take these documents and throw them into some processor and then they give us magic, because we all know that magic is actually us reading it and figuring out these ideas. Identifying these codes. And so, a big part of this is finding what are the ways that we can pick up these documents. What's a common thing that we would be interested in across these policy areas? Identifying how we want to essentially look at connections between them, do an epistemic network analysis, and then checking consistency. So this was my intro to the place. The idea is that when we can find common sets of codes, we can build measurement spaces to make them all come in conversation with each other.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Amanda. It was a tour de force. So I'd like to, open things up to the audience or also to the other panelists. If you have questions or comments about what Amanda just shared, I know that there's a lot more depth that can be provided. But I think that was a really nice kind of coverage of things. Goal, I see you unmuting.
Yeah, I have something to say. Hi, Amanda. So good
Hi,
to see your face. Yes, fantastic presentation, just visually wonderful. So I wanted to talk about, I know you said you're talking more about the coding, but in terms of a policy lens, just coding seems so much more high stakes to me, thinking about that. And first of all, like creating that fixed measurement space and being able to put in all these different sources of data into that fixed measurement space is phenomenal. I can just see the potential for that in your context and in GSS context, but also in broader policy contexts where we want to go beyond the measurement tools that we already have. But that being said, my question is really about the coding process. And you said it was, I liked your steps, and you were talking about that it's a grounded procedure. But we all know that our biases and our theoretical stances affect that, how we look at that data. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that? When the stakes are so high for policy and you're using some form of grounded analysis, what influences, like you can use NGSS as an example, like what framed your analysis? What were you looking for? Was it, what literature were you grounding it in? And were you basically aligned with what the NGSS policies and values were, or was it just much more complicated than that?
Absolutely. Probably the hardest and most fun part about this whole project is the code part. I think you're absolutely right. When I started this project, I knew I was stepping in it, and I knew that I wanted to make sure that I was being smart about the codes that I found. For that reason, I used, and I kind of elided this, but I used the NGSS proposes science and engineering practice and cross-cutting concepts. They list essentially the codes, the things that they want people to learn and teach. And so I used 100% their list of codes. That being said, I still had to do a grounded analysis because, essentially they would provide lists and lists and lists of things that they might look for in terms of, let's say, planning and carrying out investigations. And I had to find a way to operationalize that in the textbooks and the classroom discourse. And so having a common set of codes helped narrow that down, narrow the focus of what I was looking for in these other arenas. But in this case, what I did was using the actual things that they valued within the document as a way to code the document. And you're right, I think as we think about how we might create measurement spaces that allow us to compare across different types of documents, that the choice of what we look for is going to be the biggest choice and the hardest choice to figure out, what's going to be valued, what's going to be helpful and useful, what are the claims we're going to want to make across these documents.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what I'm hearing you say, and then I'll stop talking and give other people an opportunity, but what I'm hearing you say is for this specific project, they had the cross-cutting concepts, right? I know NGSS really well. And you use that as the framing. And then within that, you were looking for, okay, if I'm looking at a textbook or a student notebook, what actually counts as conducting an experiment? What counts as, visualizing data in a graph? And so that's interesting to me, because sometimes grounded analysis is so much broader. And in this example, it sounds like it's really like constrained with what the values of NGSS and the direction of NGSS. And then within that, you were kind of, it's like a sandbox within that. So thank you for sharing that. I think I love hearing examples of what the nitty gritty looks like.
So, and that was so I'll quickly answer one more thing on this. And then I see Leanne has asked a little bit more about the findings and what was surprising. When I've done this work with other documents, it might be things like someone has a mission statement, and the mission statement outlines 7 core values of their organization. That's the sort of thing that I might start with for a coding exercise to figure out, if this is what their organization values, how might their HR docs reflect that? How might the discussions and trainings reflect that? How might all the, any other sort of thing that we can turn into a piece of text data, we could then use those values documents, because as you know, finding and identifying codes is a very difficult process. And in this case, a lot of times we have documents that already tell us what people value. They've already had, 100 meetings about what's of value. Let's use those in those places. What did I find surprising? From what I know about the NGSS, it was a lot of people working on it. And I was very surprised that I could essentially take their documents, turn it into data, take their own codes, put it in, and that the elementary, middle, and high school separated naturally in ENA, and that the different sciences separated on the second dimension. I've been working in ENA for a long time, but it was very surprising to me that it was able to pick up this with just very minimal inputs, be able to pick up the documents and find differences in a way that I would have only dreamed that it did. And it did it by, it did it without as much input as I would have thought. And so I was very surprised to see that. It was also very interesting because I think it can do some, this presentation is talking about how we make this based on NGSS and then we use it all over the place. But even just looking at the standards themselves, even just staying in that one document, you can learn a lot about what the values are in life sciences versus physical sciences. And I didn't think that would actually come out. And part of it is it the writer? We know this person that's writing really loves models. Is that reflective of the field? And so that's some analysis that I would be interested in doing later and talking to the people that wrote it.
That was great. Amanda, I also remember when you first showed me that model and it blew me away too, like that, just how nicely things laid out. And it was just like, because we'd been talking about this conceptually and it blew my mind.
Yeah.
I want to circle back a little bit to the question that Goal asked as well about the coding process and use that as a segue to transition to Lydia and Nancy, who will go next. And we're lucky enough to also have Brett and Jayoon here, whose posters talk about the work that's about to be shared. And they're the ones who are doing a lot of the work on the coding and trying to do exactly what Goal was talking about, how difficult it is. And there's some thoughts that are going around that. So you want to check out their posters later, because I believe they're both nominated for Best Poster Awards. But with that, as a segue for us, Lydia and Nancy, can you share some of your experiences and visions related to using ENA and QE in your own work? And we'll kind of look at a new example here.
Yeah, so why don't I just share my slides to give you a little bit of an introduction of, what we've been doing. Sorry, I know it's been a long time and I should be like expert at sharing and I still struggle, but I'll do my best. Okay. Okay, can you see my slides now? Yeah, good. So yeah, Nancy and I started working with Social Security Administration a little bit over 2 years ago. Our first project, we kind of like submitted a proposal mainly with the idea of using online Social Security disability insurance conversations to improve the communication and outreach, which Social Security has a lot of interest on working on. Just to mention, now these projects have evolved and we have both, as Brendan mentioned, like Brett who's a student in our department, and Yoon Shu, who's a student in education psychology department, working on independent projects that had come out of that. But a little bit of background. So Social Security disability insurance provides benefit to workers who become disabled. And actually there's a staggering amount of 9.8 million beneficiaries as of 2019. This has actually gone in decline slightly, which is, one of the reasons Social Security wants to learn more about how to reach out to the beneficiaries, those that need access to the program. And they understand the program application process is complex and time consuming. However, we currently, pay about 124 billion in cash benefits annually. This is kind of like where, the process is quite complex. The application and appeals timeline looks like this. There's roughly about 2 million applications a year. These are initial applications. And out of those initial applications, 65% of them get denied, like they initially deny, and only 35% of them get awarded. Then out of those, roughly 1.3 million applications that get denied, the first process takes about 3 months. But then the 65% remaining in the denial pile go on for about 22 more months, trying to appeal and about 28% of those get denied on appeal, and 67% of those eventually get awarded. So a good chunk of the ones that were initially denied ended up being awarded. About only 5% of them drop application. This is very important for Social Security Administration because the extended length and the procedures end up having a significant strain on the applicants because you delay access to them. I mean, these are individuals that really need access to the money. They cannot work because that would affect their qualifying, their qualification for the benefits. And during that time, they don't have access to the benefits that can mean access to health insurance or access to other health services. It also puts administrative burden and preventable costs on Social Security Administration because once these denied applications get eventually awarded, they have to be paid back. So they end up being, a lot of different challenges. Sometimes the payback is too much, or sometimes the payback is too little. And also many times in these individuals, these applicants have to hire representation from lawyers. So 67% of the Social Security Administration's annual costs represent administrative costs. That's roughly $4 billion. Social Security has shown quite an interest in, in the project that we initially proposed. Initially, we were just using user-generated content, this as online forums that have conversation among applicants, those that are either going to apply, have applied, or are in the process. We just proposed to collect data from those forums to evaluate the customer experience and process varies. That first year, we mainly just used ENA and structured data to see what the conversations were around Social Security disability insurance among individuals, that were interested on this. It was mainly text analytics, and we actually, because I am an economist and Nancy's a psychologist, we actually use topic modeling to find codes. It's also because this is large data, right? We collected about over 150,000 posts. And our idea was, well, let's collect these posts and then do some topic modeling. And then bring this into the NI space to look at how the conversations are structured online. After that, in the second year, we actually ended up connecting with the QE lab, and that was great. We started to enrich our data with better methodologies, and now we currently, as Brendan mentioned, Brett is going to be presenting his poster that relates to study one, which is identifying information differences between application and appeal processes. What Brett is doing is that he's trying to explore whether information shared by forum users and topic connections are different between conversations about the application and the appeal process. So we know that this complex timeline, ends up, individuals early in the process might not be identifying the key information that they need to provide for the Social Security Administration to determine whether the case is eligible. So we're trying to explore in that. What are the questions that individuals are asking in online forums if they are planning to just apply for disability insurance versus if they are going to their appeal process. And then we're just trying to explore what are the areas of confusions or sources of struggle during these processes. Study 2, which is the one that Yoyun is going to present in her poster, is how did I claims, basically Social Security Administration introduce the ability to apply online for disability insurance, with the idea that is going to facilitate the process and increase access for many more applicants. And we were curious about whether this is actually changing the applicant's learning and application process. And we have what we think very interesting results, contrary to what we were expecting. And I think it would be great if you guys attend the posters because they will go into much more detail. I'm not adding the space here, but we were really happy to talk more about our experience in working with Social Security Administration. We're working with this freely available data for anyone that might be interested about it.
Great, thank you, Lydia. I have some questions and things that I could ask, but I want to open things up now to see if there's anything else that our other panelists or folks in the audience today would like to ask about what was just shared or thinking about using publicly available data in terms of investigating policy, or specifically thinking about Social Security disability insurance? So we can open things up. All right, well, I guess I'll lead things off then with some of the questions that I have. So I think when we've talked about this, you've mentioned the importance of communicating QE research and how that can be kind of challenging. And I wonder if you and Nancy could talk about, and Brett and Jayon, if they wanted to chime in as well, but talk about how you've thought about that, and you know, where you see either some opportunities and benefits of using these approaches versus where you have to, you know, be carefully curating your messages to help people consume and understand ENA or QE.
Well, I'll give I'll do one quick thing, and then Nancy has actually had a lot of experience, you know, sharing these results as well. But I think early on we noticed that Social Security Administration was really interested about this idea, mainly because most of the applications they receive are from like economists or, you know, people that are more leaning towards quantitative research, and rarely individuals are looking at more qualitative data. But they were interesting because we kind of like proposed it as a way of like quantifying, you know, this qualitative approach, and I think that really caught their attention. However, when I first presented results, I felt like they were kind of like lost. And it might have been in part because, you know, I was also kind of new to ENA, and I was like, you know, myself explaining ENA. But at the same time, I think for, you know, I have said this before, I think when thinking about outreach to these new communities, one of the challenges is documentation, like, you know, like just kind of like having more simplified ways of introducing ENA, you know, or, you know, one thing I'm really interested in is encoder, introducing encoder to the community, to those communities, in a much more concise way. Like I tried to explore like the many papers and the many documents, and of course that took me a lot of time. And so, you know, I think that needs to be, as a community, that needs to be like concise in a much more like, you know, like policy briefs or other ways. So that's the first thing I have to mention about that. I don't know if Nancy has anything else to add.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to chime in on that. Actually, one of the most important reasons for us to embark on this research right from the beginning is the fact that if you think about a government, you know, organizations such as the Social Security Administration, they have tons of administrative data in terms of the number of applicants, how many were, you know, approved, how many were denied. All of this were like, you know, historical records that they have. Of course, they need to maintain that system. And you have economists pouring through all this data and trying to match it with other perspectives, but they are all large-scale survey data as well as administrative data. This is really the only approach that is available that we actually get to see it from the applicants' perspectives that the administration is lacking. So I think the data and the insights that we find here, it's a really important perspective that they would not otherwise have knowledge of. I mean, they know that people are getting tied up in the systems, and, you know, the numbers speak to itself that, you know, it is a long and confusing process, but they have no idea of knowing what is the problem, because this actually allows us to identify where the pinch points in that application process lies. And I think what is astounding about, I think, the application of ENA in comparing these, I think, subtraction models between the two differences actually allowed us to identify exactly where the problems lie. And we can actually go back to verify that information based on administrative data and provide very concrete and specific interventions possibly that could actually help, hopefully, you know, reduce that kind of obstacles that applicants face. So I think that is a very sort of like important insights that would not be available without ENA and, you know, this particular approach.
And something that Nancy mentions touches on, so Eric had pointed out like, well, what are we learning that we don't know yet? And I think like, you know, yeah, I think SSA has a sense about like, you know, the applicants struggling, and they hear from the case workers that, you know, the applicants are having a hard time with, you know, maybe the online application or whatever not. but this actually quantifies it, which is important in the policy realm, right? To like have, receipts of like, this is where we have an issue, let's, take action. So we think that's what Social Security Administration has really, like that.
Yeah. I think getting story to harmonize with numbers and statistics is really beneficial. It's something that I think is going to be explored in the Indigenous QE session as well, and thinking about policy and how you take different ways of knowing and understanding, in this case from the recipient's perspective, and how do you share that and quantify that with policymakers. I noticed Leanne also kind of built off of Goal's question previously about advantages and disadvantages of human coding versus topic modeling for the codes. And I know this is something that we've kind of talked about internally in this research group, but I'm wondering if anybody wants to share with respect to Leanne's question about kind of the affordances and constraints of doing human coding versus topic modeling versus also encoder, or how those things go together. Does anybody want to speak to that?
I don't want to take the whole time, but I will say something, and then I'm actually going to ask Brett and Yoyun to share their experience. I'm going to put them on the spotlight because they're the ones that have to go through the process. So I did the first topic modeling, right? And I think topic model is a great like entryway. I didn't know anything about coding, and it was impossible for me to look at these like 150,000 documents. So I think this is what I'm excited about Encoder Plus, because it's kind of like a hybrid of that. It's like, mixing in, giving people a start when they're dealing with large data. So I think there's benefit to topic modeling when you're working with large data, it just gives you a start. But as we have done in this working group, like, we keep on enriching. Like once we get the sense, like, then we bring in the human judgment, and, we start to like actually dig and explore. And now we have really pinned down in our topics really well. And some of the regional topic modeling are still there, but, we kind of like added our own that came out of the data. So I don't know if Yoyun and Brett want to say anything, or Nancy, but I just wanted to put the students on the spotlight and give them an opportunity to say something as well.
Sure, yeah, I guess I'll quickly add in that, yeah, I guess I don't really see topic modeling and human coding as separate things. I just kind of see them as different facets of that same coding process. Because one of the nice things about LDA is, or any other topic modeling algorithm, is it does identify those latent topics, but it identifies words, right, that are most probabilistically associated with those topics. So you can then use those as kind of seed words for encoding or using encoder and doing that human coding. That was really, really helpful. So it was nice to kind of have that other lens, especially when you're doing that topic modeling, it's still grounded in the data, right? So it's just another way of kind of getting at especially these large scale data sets that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So I think they really do a nice job of kind of complementing one another.
Just to add a little bit on that. So when we talked about so which codes that we're going to use after we did topic modeling, we decided to just go back to the data, as Siebert Evenstone said. And I, took a lot of time, just, started to read the Excel file, which has like 150,000 lines of data set. And I thought at first, even though, I'm at the lab that developed the encoder, I was in doubt, like, how can I, like read the whole data set and found the meaningful codes. But I realized that reading data really helped us understand this context, especially topic modeling. Based on the topic modeling, we were able to get some codes that are specifically related to SSDA context, like pain, medical evidence, and whatnot. But we are also interested in how applicants interact with SSA and how, like which interactional aspect they're having difficulties with. And I don't think any of our topic modeling captured that. But while reading the data set, I was able to figure out, like, okay, this pattern is something that they're struggling with, or this sort of communication way that they're sort of like finding difficult. So I think, as Brett said, they're not like mutually exclusive, but they have different facets. So the long and short of it is we have to, do both and find which one is better for our data sets.
Nice, thank you, Jae-yoon and Brett and all of you. I'd like to, at any point, we can kind of circle back to what Amanda has shared and also what Lydia and Nancy and Brett and Jae-yoon have just been sharing. But I'd like to pivot right now to talk, or to ask Moira and Eric to tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that they've seen in the policy world and talk about different ways in which they see QE or QE tools overcoming some of those challenges. So I'll turn things over. It looks like Moira is unmuted and ready to go. All right.
Thank you, Brendan. And thank you also to Eric for introducing me to this community, which has been very enriching and very interesting. So just, can everybody see the slides? Is that working? Great. Okay, so you know what this is, you know what we're talking about. The first thing that I wanted to just sort of really highlight, because I'm coming from this obviously from education and development perspective, is the diversity of actors in global education government. So UNESCO is the one that most people would think about, but UNESCO has many, many, many divisions inside it, just in the headquarters in Paris, much less before we start talking about all of the specialized agencies. And as you can see over here, IIEP is not only IIE Paris, it has another sub-agency in Dakar in Senegal. So there's an enormous amount of complexity just built into the policy space that we're looking at. Then you've got nation states, particularly donors making a difference, World Bank and OECD. We have different types of funding bodies, multi-stakeholder, the foundations, those that only fund a very specific thing. So Education Cannot Wait is for education emergencies only. There's a network just for that. There's a global campaign, which has regional bodies, which have national bodies attached to it. And then you obviously have textbook companies and other private sector actors. So just to say that, you know, when we're talking about policy space, it's an enormously crowded policy space. And it's something that we do need to be extremely careful of. And I just wanted to give you a quick example of International Geneva. This is the lovely green city where I live. And a project that was funded by the Swiss Department for Training, Research and Innovation. So we're looking at, we coded basically the SDGs inside International Geneva on the basis of going and checking that people were actually doing work on it, not just claiming, because we all know that there's an awful lot of claiming that goes on that isn't necessarily actually happening. And we mapped that, and you can see on the outside of this social network map, apologies, it's not an ENA one. On the outside there, those are the ones that only coded to one single SDG. And you can see SDG 16, which is peace and justice, has an awful lot that code only to that, but the vast majority code across several SDGs. So one of the questions that was put to us in the policy question was actually about saying it's not just about education, but how it then also goes into these other sectors and how that works across. And you can see just that close up on education. There's a lot of activity there. There are local, there are national, there are global institutions that are involved. And just with education in emergencies, there's a hub that has just that, with that number of organizations that are involved in it. So it's really about saying the complexity of this is absolutely enormous. Some sort of quick thoughts that I thought might be useful to leave you with for discussion. My initial thoughts on this: I think QE can absolutely help research, because policy research itself is limited by the analytical tools at its disposal. And I think QE is going to just give an enormous boost to the kind of research that people can do and be able to do. It does still require some content knowledge, but that can be done in collaboration with others or within a team. And then it can help coordination within the same organization as well as across several. This is something that being in a city like Geneva or New York or Washington or Paris, where you have all of these international organizations, you realize the amount of competition rather than coordination that happens. And then also the duplication both within organizations as well as between them. However, always, we can't take for granted these things that are called standards, because there's an enormous amount of normative underpinnings that go on. And there are certain where you can look at it and you can say, right, what is the purpose of education? What is the educational philosophy of this organization? And the World Bank will be very different to UNESCO, will be very different to the Global Campaign for Education, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a certain amount of, and I'm not saying it's something that's specific to QE, but it's something that we have to be careful of when, particularly when looking at large corpuses of documents, because there are an enormous amount of documents produced by every single one of those organizations. The policy practice gap is enormous, because an awful lot of international organizations will produce a policy and it won't necessarily go anywhere. So while we're looking at the policy documentation and analyzing it, we need to be careful about what we're saying this policy document is doing, and track it through in the very inspiring way that Amanda did into practice as well. And then there has to be, for the work that I do, an additional dimension, which is south-north, west, west, non-west, however it is that you like to take it, because fundamentally, these international cities are small. And at the moment, what is happening is there's supposed to be an enormous influence from north to south, but there is very little from south to north, whereas actually one of the beauties of QE, I think, would also be to look at how it is that local innovations and decolonized practices and indigenized practices are being given some space and voice, both locally, nationally, and then regionally and globally. Fingers crossed. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Moira. Thank you for sharing that. Should we, Eric, do you want to follow right up, or should we leave space to discuss what Moira just shared? Because I know you had some slides as well. You're muted yet.
Maybe I can share a few things. And Moira, I hope you didn't copyright your presentation, because I picked up one of your slides, if that's all right.
That's fine.
So, and I won't use the show mode. I'll use the draft mode, because it's a little bit easier for me and you can see what's coming up. I really appreciated the outline of all the different actors in this space, in broad policy spaces, and wanted in this short conversation to talk a little bit about early childhood care and education, or ECCE, and general education. Do it from a vantage of having worked near Moira's office in Geneva. And the slide I swapped is this one. Out of all these agencies, and Moira, I don't see NORAG on here. I think you might be a little bit in the southern part. But
we're down in the bottom left where it says Bâtiment Rothschild.
Yeah,
that's where we are.
Okay. So, and this is leading up to the train station. I was out here at IBE UNESCO, across the street from the World Health Organization. And, you know, hi, Mom, this little yellow out here is just across the airport in France, and where my wife and I lived when we were there. Our interest in policy, and what led to some conversations with Moira, originated in a couple of areas of what we call self-assessment in really critical areas. And the two that I mentioned are early childhood care and education, and general education. Both of these are, and Moira explained this well, on education, they are critical, urgent areas. There is virtually nothing that has a greater return on investment, nor a greater calamity on world or global well-being than addressing early childhood care. And I can say something similar in education, but let me start with early childhood care. And where we came in with an idea in a prospect for using QE and ENA. And that is, over the last 10 years, actually since about 2010, there's been a growing or burgeoning literature in the medical and education communities that the greatest hindrance to promoting early childhood care globally, which is a crisis that is affecting all of us and will affect us even more, is the lack of coordination between all the different entities within the early childhood care sector. So an initiative that we undertook was called the Early Childhood Care and Education Prototype. And I'm putting this up because I want to highlight these elements that I have the mouse going over: programs, institutions, policies, judiciary, finances, culture, and evaluation. Every country addresses early childhood care with and from these different sectors. And each of these has an entirely different set of, as Moira called it, norms and standards. There are cultural overlays. And it turns out that we have a huge epistemological problem. People don't understand, officials don't understand the inner workings of their own sector, let alone how they interact with other sectors. What can QE or ENA do? What we've tried to promote in what we call a self-assessment system, which is a very complex process of analyzing what's going on in each of these domains, is to create knowledge maps or understandings that can be coded that can then show the gaps in the bottlenecks where these different subsectors are not interacting. So the burgeoning literature originates in a simple observation that there's not enough coordination, there's too much fragmentation. And the reason it's taken 12 years, and the reason the literature keeps growing, is because this is enormously complicated to see and understand with some resolution how agencies are functioning in a dysfunctional way and wind up damaging the futures of the early childhood population. So the operationalization of QE and ENA, which now that institute that I showed you has completely changed its charter. So this is more notional. It's something that we started, but then we weren't able to continue, is to carry out self-assessments by which documents can be coded and then by which bottlenecks and important connections can be revealed. We've tried exactly the same thing in general education. This is the General Education Quality Assistance Framework and Quality Analysis. And same thing here. All of these different sections or sectors of general education, and this is primarily in low-income countries where this has been applied, we've tried to carry out self-assessments that require people to adopt an ethnographic mindset to understand structural relations that go beyond whatever sector they represent. So here we have 15 different sectors that all make for an education system, and they work at cross purposes. So the intent of the conversations that I've had originally with Moira and then with others in Madison is to take steps to carry out coding through self-diagnosis of these different sectors, and then to identify means by which they can function together more efficiently and productively. It's more notional than I would like at this time, but that one part of UNESCO that we were in is sort of a think tank part, and it's no longer a think tank within UNESCO, but I think it's very promising, and it's sort of a way to look at interagency cooperation and productivity.
Great, thank you, Eric. I think, at least for me, one of the nice things is to see some of the challenges in the lay of the land that you and Moira have articulated, and think with, you know, the what Amanda shared at the beginning is if we have this shared metric space, what that could allow, what type of communication and shared understanding. And so that was really cool. I also appreciate the kind of focus on kind of the directionality of the policy work and who gets to inform things. I'm hoping that we can connect with both Meishi and Kahiwa, who are working on Indigenous QE and thinking about those aspects, because that Moira, you mentioned as well, and I think there's some nice potential for sharing of ideas and there. But I'd like to open things up now, again, within the panel and also to the audience to and it's too bad is I think goal left, but I was also going to mention some of the work that's going on in participatory QE in her lab and with one of her graduate students, Hazel, is working on, and also some folks down in Australia, Mike Phillips, Simon Buckingham-Schoen, among others, who are doing a lot of work to think through how would you engage data providers or participants or these other aspects to engage them with the meaning making and kind of how they could link in with QE. But I'll open things up now to the audience to see if there are specific questions that they have for our panelists or comments that they'd like to make, and also just allow the panelists to discuss with each other too if they have questions or comments based on what was shared. But let's open things up at this point. What questions do people have?
I guess
Nancy,
I'll start. Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to just jump in like that, but I think it's more something that came out during Amanda's presentation and maybe to a lesser extent to Eric as well as Moira's presentation, because they're both about educational policy. It's, is there any possibility of, because, I'm not in the education fields from that perspective, but we're always talking about learning outcomes and various other forms of assessments. In what you have identified in terms of, the different curriculum space and the policy sectors, are there any attempts, or is it even possible to try to link these differences or gaps that you have identified in your ENA models towards some kind of a learning outcome kind of assessments? Do you think that's possible? I mean, I'm just thinking about it from a predictive modeling standpoint, or maybe not for the entire curriculum, but some aspects of it.
So
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Is that okay? Sorry, I'm only seeing half of the people on my screen, so I'm not sure who else is speaking. Forgive me. So I think so. There's one question which is the politics of measurement and the politics of data, and sort of how it's moved from comparative knowledge of education systems to performance-based accountability tools to from the measurement of schooling to the measurement of learning. And so I think I just wanted to make the broader point about the politics of data and measurement and why we're seeing certain things coming up as priorities, as well as accepting that it is a priority and then working out how we can support that particular priority. But I'm sure Amanda has much more to say about this.
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of different things we think about in these analyses. So both Leanne and Gulnaz brought up this idea of, how are you finding the codes? What are you looking for? We know that there's a lot of politics involved in that. And so you see, in my analysis, I tried to go, I'm just going to use what you guys said was important. Or, folks will say, let's use topic modeling because then it's just your words that are doing it. And I think that fundamentally is a big discussion that we can talk about in terms of, what are the things that we choose to look for have a lot of identity and cultural pieces that are a part of it. And, what gets to be a part of the conversation, we know that people are systematically not included. In terms of, while ENA is not the only thing that you could do, you could easily look at, if someone says this is a value, you could just simply look at, does my data have this or not? A very one-to-one mapping. I essentially went with the ENA model because I was coming from a theoretical framework that I thought learning was fundamentally connected. And one benefit of having done an ENA model is that all of the scores are actually just values that you could import and use in regression equations to predict assessment outcomes. So there's no reason that we couldn't essentially bring it all into conversation not just in ENA spaces, but in other qualitative or quantitative methods, depending on the theory that we're coming from and the goals that we have.
One of the cool things I think about your work, Amanda, to me, is that you can also do that with enacted curriculum, planned curriculum. So it could be practice-based, right? It could be policy-based in terms of like, you know, what I think Moira and Eric were talking about in terms of fragmented systems and getting those to speak to each other. But then if you have that space, you could say, okay, well, here's the policy side of it. But then if we look in a specific place, what's actually happening with early childhood education? You could look at to different performance outcomes or whatever metrics you might be interested in. There's the potential to link those things up and have them speak to each other. That's not trivial necessarily, but there is a vision there, I think, and that could be enacted. And part of it comes down to building the methodological capacity and the language to communicate these things, but also engaging with the different stakeholders to get them, whether it's through self-assessments or getting these groups to, I think Moira, you kind of pointed out, there's some competing interests, right, in some of these things, right? If they're in competition or there's wasted efforts. And I think that that's another aspect of, not only do we have to do the hard work of kind of marshaling these ideas and these approaches, but then there's the challenge of how do we also then put those in conversation or deal with some of the other broader political currents that we're navigating.
And sorry, 30 seconds more on this one, because it is a very important question, is also to be able to say, you know, sort of where are these things coming from? Are they local priorities, local innovations that are being taken seriously and scaled, so to speak, or are we just taking these global norms and standards as the thing, and then basically sort of putting other people against this benchmark, which, you know, is questionable.
I'd just add on the question on outcomes, and Brendan, your comment just now about competition, those are two really large issues. On the question of outcomes, the whole terminology of learning outcomes has often been organized around enhancing what people know or getting kids to be able to say something. And I don't simply mean on tests, which we know is not, but rather than what kids know or we teach, what can kids do? And so the global movement towards competence is one that is less about what you call learning outcomes and towards competency. So there's one issue right there in terms of what is valued as a so-called outcome, and how does any entity, a nation state, come to agreement on that? And the other, on your comment about competition, that's part of this whole area of building ethnographic mindsets. This is not a problem just of big data. Big data tools are giving us ways to move past some competition, but ultimately there's a human issue that people don't understand. They view one another competitively, or they view the other silo competitively, not having internalized the competence of working with the other silo, because that's the only way you can move forward. And so some of these issues of defragmentation really go to changing not just the machinery of analysis, but changing the people who are there and doing the analysis.
That is a very nice way to mark the technically what could be the end of our session. So I'd like to just mention to folks, we do have time to continue on if we'd like. We can also move over into the community chats to, you know, get a chance to connect with other folks that are at the conference, and we can still continue that conversation on there. But we can also decide to stay in this space for another 15 minutes to continue to discuss things. But this technically could be a stopping point for us. So, and I know we just engaged with some fairly large and difficult to wrestle with ideas. So I'd like to just give an opportunity for anyone else in the audience to ask a question really quick, and then we can maybe get a sense from the panelists if we'd rather continue to stay on here, or if we want to take an opportunity to go out into the community chats. But also just thanks everyone for not only the audience and panelists for coming and sharing your ideas and insights. It's been wonderful for me. All right, so Eric's got to go to that. Maybe that kind of answers the question for us, is like we can move into the community chats. Yeah, this is wonderful.